to this distinguished panel. It's an honor to be here. As a former journalist, now turned lawyer, I have incredible respect for reporting the news and the incredible difficult work. Today I was asked to speak about the legal harassment that journalists are facing. And I think sometimes we see this on a global scale as something that are attacks against the press. But what I'll talk a little bit about today is how some of these attacks are not being housed in the term of press freedoms, but using different areas of law to target journalists and specifically make it more difficult to do their work. But I do want to take a minute just as an attorney here in the U.S. and working for an organization that supports press freedom here to look at the current landscape of journalists in the U.S. Similar to the World Press Freedom Index, we have a U.S. press freedom tracker that takes a look at what's happening here on the ground for journalists, both from a legal perspective as well as attacks and assaults and imprisonment against journalists. And since 2017, here in the U.S., there have been 1,000 assaults, mostly at the hands of law enforcement, against journalists in the United States. 2020 and 2021, not surprisingly, were exceptionally bad. 630 journalists in 2020 were assaulted, 145 in 2021. And although the numbers are lower this year, we're continue to remain troubled about the state of press freedom here in the U.S., which of course boasts to have the First Amendment and some incredible legal protections for press, but as you can tell from those numbers, not by any means free from issues. And of course, just to mention, top of mind are the recent deaths of 2 journalists here in the U.S. Jeff Gurman, a veteran investigative reporter for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, was killed last September, allegedly by the subject of one of his investigations. A few months after that, Dylan Lyons, a reporter for Spectrum News in Florida, was fatally shot while reporting on the scene. And of course, as we know, journalists should not have to fear reporting this information. They shouldn't have to fear challenging public officials who have been accused or misused their office or betraying the public trust. So it remains crucial to know that these journalists are out there covering these communities and how we have to make sure that communities are informed and that we hold those in power accountable for their actions. And we see this several ways in the U.S. We have an ability, and a lot of the work that I do is to make sure that we're protecting journalists' access to local records. And so journalists are often thwarted by government officials by obtaining requests for certain government records, and legal protections can help kind of make sure that that critical information is in the hands of journalists as they need it. Turning to more of the legal elements, although again, we have a lot of protections here on the ground in the U.S., journalists have been confronted with a wide range of legal threats here, including subpoenas and prior restraints. For those who might not be familiar with prior restraint, those are court orders that prevent news organizations or journalists from publishing newsworthy information. So they essentially bar journalists from reporting on matters of public interest. And in 2022, we saw several prior restraint cases here in the U.S. Thankfully, some of the judicial system is working, and those most of those were reversed or dissolved. But again, these orders have a significant chilling effect, and unless they're ultimately blocked, they can stop reporters from reporting on crucial stories. And I do want to take a moment to kind of share what I think is a bright spot in journalism here in the U.S. and also across the globe, which is what's always existed, but I think it might be coming more into the public eye, which is local journalism, community reporting, individuals from their community going to open meetings, making sure that they're covering whether it be a school board hearing or how election funds are being spent in their district or community. I've spent most of this past year working on the ground in several states here in the US, looking at smaller news organizations, sometimes 2 or 3 journalists, reporting on police accountability, local government officials' abuse. And these individuals are doing such crucial work, and they really are sometimes the eyes and ears of the community. And so I do see kind of a bright spot of local journalism happening across the country. Now, whether or not, it's out there if you look for it, but whether or not you can find this local journalism, I think is still a lot of the crucial work that we have to do and make sure that we're looking at all aspects of reporting. But in doing some of this work, what I'm seeing from a legal perspective becoming a threat is the actual status of the organization itself. So as you can imagine, many newspapers have shuttered, news organizations have been dissolved, and individuals are starting to find creative models to encourage news and reporting. And one of the ways that they're doing that is by creating nonprofit institutions that still have the journalistic ethics of a news organization, but they're built in to be able to receive grants and individual donations to cover their reporting. And part of this is because just in general to support what's happening on the ground. And what we're seeing from a legal perspective, unfortunately, is when the reporting of these smaller news organizations, which, as I mentioned, are generally a handful of people, they're almost always from the community, born and raised and living in the communities where they're reporting. They're often working potentially in a language that's not English. And individuals are threatening their nonprofit status. So essentially, without their nonprofit status, they wouldn't be able to report the news because they would have no funding. So we've seen threats against that type of status, kind of a new way to threaten reporting. And then turning globally, similarly, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of times press freedom is, governments have become very clever about talking more about press freedom, perhaps even enacting laws across different countries to help show as if they're on the press's side. But I think what's happened is that the legal rhetoric and ways in which press are being threatened have changed. Governments and leaders have learned to talk very expressively about press freedom and protection of journalists, but oftentimes that's other areas of law, often complex and difficult to navigate areas of law, are happening. We've seen this, of course, in like the case of Maria Ressa that faced a barrage of charges from the Philippine government. These charges were a series of criminal and civil cases, including tax evasion, violations of foreign ownership rules, and these areas of law are so complex and so difficult to navigate without expert legal counsel, and they know this. They know that it's difficult to be able to have the funding to do this work. It's difficult to be able, when an individual gets a complaint like this, to be able to even navigate the area of law or how they respond to this request. And thankfully, there is pro bono support for some journalists, but a lot of times these threats aren't related to press freedom laws themselves, but they're criminal cases that involve significant legal action, also legal action that takes years to evaluate and change. And so as an eternal optimist, I just want to close by ending with potentially a few solutions. I think number one, we have to make sure that individuals, journalists, newsrooms, like across the country and the globe, understand how critical legal support and how legal support needs to be an infrastructure that's funded, and whether that's done by civil society, individuals, or community groups. We need to make sure that journalists that are doing this difficult work are supported from a legal perspective. We need to make sure that they have access to legal assistance at every stage of reporting, investigation, as Paula's really meaningful and intimate portrait of her online abuse. We see this constantly for journalists, and many of them don't know what to do. So we have to increase training about how they can be able to help. But even when that happens, potentially law enforcement officials don't even know what to do, or they don't have the bandwidth, or they just don't bother with doing it. And in that vein, we need to make sure that we're growing the bench of attorneys that are serving journalists, making sure that legal counsel is available to mitigate risks and address these non-press freedom areas of law that often include these criminal and complex areas of law. And yeah, those are some of the solutions that a lot of folks are involved in and moving forward. Thank you for your time.